In any year, there's anywhere between 150 to 190,000 students across Australia who sit the HSC each year. Now, many of these students are then assigned ATARs, a university admissions rank that sorts them into these minute bands of 0.05%. These marks then determine the courses that they're able to study at university, and for a select few, they will work untold hours, placing extreme amounts of stress on themselves for a mark that will be used once, for an university admissions place that will then be discarded, never to be used again. Now, outside of an elite athlete whose whole career can come down to one singular performance, one race, one match, one game, the rest of us are permitted failures. We get second chances. Now, in my view, the current ATAR system is wasteful and frankly harmful. It's wasteful because the current system encourages HSC students to invest an enormous amount of effort and energy into this mark that will never be referenced again. And it's harmful because it encourages our universities to make a false assumption that a kid who gets 99 is smarter than a kid who gets 98. I think that's rubbish. And I'll give you one example that explains why. Space engineering at the University of Sydney requires a mark of 99. Law at the same university requires a mark of 99.5. According to this admissions process, lawyers need to be smarter than rocket scientists, literal rocket scientists. I'm proposing that we start to think about capping the marks that are given out so that the maximum mark that a child can receive in the HSC is 95. It sends a message to these very fortunate, very intelligent students that they are smart, that they're very, very smart. But it will mean that our universities, by necessity, will have to develop other methods to manage their admissions. They'll need to account for students' other skills, be it sport or drama or music or debating or volunteering or leadership or interview skills. All the sorts of soft skills that we want our students to be investing in to be more productive members of society. Employers are crying out for university graduates who are better rounded, because with automation and artificial intelligence on the rise, the jobs of the future will depend on human qualities that are not so easily reduced to a single number. So we should stop assigning so much value to it. So, Catherine, am I being too easy? Am I being too soft on them?
No, there's merit in what you say about having your whole life hinge on one invigilated set of exams and a result, and I echo your sentiments about the kids facing that dilemma this year. I think we've got huger problems in both the tertiary and the secondary education sectors than the ATAR mark, though. It's a question of the curriculum, what is being taught, and I also think the university model's broken. It's far too reliant on foreign students at massively inflated fees. We've got bloated vice-chancellors' salaries, and you've got effectively a market that had one large customer, China, dictating both freedom of speech on campuses and also the flow of cash to a numerous number of these institutes and so forth. So I think there's been a derogation of standards, and yet while it is not quantifiable in a single number, I think there are vast problems with both the tertiary sector in terms of its business model that's been exposed by this pandemic, but I've also got a big problem with the lack of teaching of the basics and the fundamentals right through the school system. You say it's not teaching enough behavioural and soft skills. I think there's plenty of parents would contest that with you and argue that their kids are missing out on quite a lot of the basics, the 3 Rs and so on, and people feel voiceless in some of this curriculum experimentation that's happened.
So to be clear, I'm not arguing that the curriculum necessarily needs to change and be experimented with. I'm saying simply that we should cut it off. But let me bring Antoinette in here. Antoinette, what's your view?
Look, I'd agree with Catherine in that I think the university or the tertiary education sector has more imminent problems that it's facing in its business model, and sustainability is probably the biggest one. The lack of international students or access to international students next year is really going to cripple much of the universities. And again, with Catherine, I'd agree that for too long they've been reliant on Chinese, in particular, students. So we need a rethink of how universities are going to be funded and how they're going to be sustainable to educate our next generations of innovators and thinkers. In terms of the ATAR, I do agree that there's an enormous amount of pressure and there are particular subjects or schools or weighting or ways to ensure that you get the highest number, which isn't necessarily indicative of how clever you are or how successful you may be in the future. And I went to a selective high school for my senior years, and I think they have them in most states, so it's where you kind of sit an academic test to get in. And a lot of the students that went to school with me, and to be fair, I was among them, my migrant parents didn't have enough money to send me to a private school. And so this is where a lot of Asian and Indian and Middle Eastern kids went to just study, and get the best grades that they could possibly get. And that was often they didn't have interpersonal skills, they didn't have great social skills. And while they may get ATARs of 99 or whatever and then go on to become doctors, it wasn't necessarily a measure of, I think, how competent they'd be in a workplace or how good they'd be in dealing with others. Now, having said that, I do see that some universities have moved away from just relying on the ATAR by itself. I understand some universities like Western Sydney University, for those who achieve under 60, about 30% of those who essentially got into the university got in based on interviews and other factors, so understanding their other skills. And that's more similar to the United States model, where I think you have to sit a placement test. They have a look at your work experience, what you've done in the community, any of your volunteer work, and they judge you on that. So I think a little bit of that is already happening in Australia, perhaps more of it, but I'm not prepared quite yet to throw the ATAR out.
No, Antoinette, you're exactly right. UNSW, for instance, for their law faculty, they say that you only need 98, but you've got to sit a test and have an interview and all the rest. My worry, though, is if you allow kids, or if you allow universities to have these ranks out there, I'm worried that you're still going to allow a natural level of elitism to creep in, where one university says, well, all of our university students have 99.95 and all of yours have 98. Ipso facto, our kids are smarter than yours. That's my worry.
Well, I mean, I think the measure of success isn't the ATAR people have to get to go in. It's how ready they are in the workforce. It's who's graduating and what kind of roles those people go on to leave. It's what your alumni looks like. And I'd be interested to also see, is there a model overseas that you think Australia can learn from or lean on?
Look, so a lot of the American universities have similar admissions process to the ones that I am proposing. Now, to be fair, a number of these have been criticised by Asian American and Indian American groups as saying that they feel discriminated against, that the universities like Harvard and Yale and whatnot, they replicate themselves. So they let in, the kid who's got the Supreme Court grandparent, or the alumni just sort of replicates them through the ages. That's the criticism of this model. Daisy, what do you think?
Well, look, I did my HS. I live in Queensland now, but I did my HSC in New South Wales, and I did it so long ago that the ATAR was called a UAI back when I did it, sort of in the mid sort of 2000s. And just anecdotally talking to Queenslanders, the way that New South Wales conducts people's final exams seems to be unbelievably more stressful and with a whole lot more of a sort of guilt complex associated with it than it is in Queensland. It's something peculiar to New South Wales. The sheer emphasis, as you mentioned so rightly in your editorial, that's put on that final mark, so much stock put in one mark that will only be used once and eventually forgotten. And, people will argue that, workplaces are tough and stressful. We need kids to, be able to deal with stress. But again, as you mentioned, in the real world, there's room to muck up occasionally. There's room for failure. There's room to, get one work assignment wrong, and it's not going to completely jeopardize everything you want to do. I mean, whether it's capping the ATAR at 95, I love the idea of forcing universities to take more stock of kids' extracurricular activities. I was quite successful in my final year. I got a much higher mark than I thought I would, and I put a lot of it down to the fact that I had such huge emphasis on my dance training outside of school, for instance. I trained 3 times a week. I practiced fanatically. I did well that year in that too. It kept me fit. It kept me healthy. It kept me eating right, which I'm telling you was very, very good for my studies. And the byproduct of that was that I did unexpectedly very well at school too. And On the subject of stress, I hate to be sort of, a bit of a TMA, but I actually had a friend who committed suicide the night before our HSC exams. And while I'm sure there were other factors at play, there was no way that the pressure put on all of us didn't have at least something to do with that, I think. So anything that is going to encourage kids to branch out from purely their academic subjects, whether it's dance or sport or after-school drama classes, anything to sort of dilute that, give them a different social sphere, is only going to ultimately benefit their studies, make them better-rounded university students and therefore employees, and just do their mental health a whole lot of good, because the HSC is an artificial kind of environment. The real world doesn't function like that, and kids need to realise it.